Well, I'd just like to make a sort of introductory point in passing about Rem Koolhaas's famous point about the culture of congestion. We're perhaps so used to this phrase now, it's directed, of course, at New York rather than Hong Kong. We tend to forget that actually congestion has rather negative connotations. The fact is that compact cities really have, almost by their definition, they have to be user-friendly, they have to be people-friendly. And we deal with congestion as and best we can. But Rem Koolhaas, while we're on the subject, has made a much more permanent observation, I think, about Asian cities in general. Something that is very much directed towards Hong Kong, that they embody a tenuous quality of unrest, and I'm quoting here, that makes previous configurations expendable and all future states provisional. And when we think that the average life of a Hong Kong building is somewhere between 35 and 40 years, right up at the present time, I think you sort of get the meaning of this particular statement. In terms of our compact city model, in fact, can we in effect equate constant transformation and change, the things that we talk about all the time in relation to Hong Kong, with effective management of private and public infrastructure? Or is it the very efficiency of our urban infrastructure itself that promotes and facilitates change? And I'm making this point really because I think some of the comments made at yesterday's meeting seem to me to crystallize around this very issue. Of course, as one of New York's most eminent urban design commentators, whose work I read when I was at college, in fact, Jonathan Barnett, has shrewdly observed that whilst the forms of most world cities might be unintentional, they're never accidental. Hong Kong, in fact, is the product of innumerable decisions, as Nick's pointed out, coupled with significant events over a comparatively short span, really, of 150 years, with consequences that were almost entirely unpredictable. This wonderful painting was done round about, I should think, the middle of the 19th century. But less than 30 years later, this is what Hong Kong was actually looking like, with a wonderful waterfront and already sort of in the process of urbanization. And here's what it is today. Do we anyway want to over-prescribe what our cities should ultimately look like? Most Asian cities, including, of course, Hong Kong, with its very unique political and development pressures, have been subject to regimes that have, at some stage, established a strong underlying morphology, so that new development, in most situations, in effect, modifies rather than replaces the older urban framework. Today, we have a situation where the continuing process of transformation and change in Hong Kong in relation to the wider Pearl River Delta and in fact, the whole of southern China reflects globalizing influences that tend to personify substantial economic as well as cultural shifts. And as we now know very well, of course, economic shifts can go down as well as up. But I think when we look at this, we look at Hong Kong in relation to the wider Delta. We have major pieces of infrastructure, road and rail infrastructure, that pick up new types of investment. Nick, as well as many of his other activities, is in fact the chairman of what we see in the bottom right-hand corner there, the new science park, where there's a very strong interrelationship between Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and the wider Delta. And this wonderful little photograph here shows the new high-speed railing rushing through the North Territories to one of the border crossings, passing one of the old traditional villages. And I should say in passing that in a few years' time we're going to have a high-speed railway that cuts effectively the travel time actually in half. So these things are changing all the time, and although we've got used to Hong Kong having certain boundaries, these boundaries are of course breaking down, and Hong Kong has a dependent relationship now with the wider area in China itself. And in the process, this is really creating situations where what the city has to offer, how responsive it is to change, and how user-friendly it is to visitors, are increasingly important to future growth, social stability, and economic development. In fact, this is a very nice photograph. I used to live in one of these buildings that I think is now a barbecue pit, because half the buildings in this old barracks area were demolished to make way for a park, a very nice park too. But this also leads to both protect and reinforce the authentic spirit of the city. We've talked a lot about new high-density development, but in fact much of Hong Kong is like this. The frequently intangible blend of factors that sets the city apart and, in effect, brands its identity. The mix of uses associated with the oldest street fabric. Nick has touched on this in Hong Kong, partly because of its physical constraints of geography and water, and partly because of the perpetual but crucial shortfall of land and accommodation right through the 20th century. And natural hazards such as these, when I went to Hong Kong 30 years ago, half of Hong Kong's population were living in some form of temporary accommodation, subject to all the obvious hazards. And because of this, the formal organisation of city space, I think it's fair to say, was never really established beyond a certain level. And these three factors that I've just mentioned really paved the way for its gradual transformation into a high-rise city through redevelopment facilitated by changes to the building ordinance in order to actually encourage high-density development. Around the turn of the century, we were starting to urbanize in the urban area, and then gradually, through changes to the ordinance, we were allowed to build higher. So, you know, the right-hand slide shows a very characteristic feature of Hong Kong, the tall tenement structures, and I'll come back to that in a little while. And of course, redevelopment isn't exactly a new issue in Hong Kong. The slide on the left was made in 1862, only 20 years after Hong Kong becoming a colony, and that was the central business district. And these slides are all taken from exactly the same point. So the middle slide, in 1903, shows a complete redevelopment of what had been built only 20 or 30 years before, and the right-hand side, taken from the same position, shows what is there now. The typical Hong Kong street or urban district lacks the typological uniformity that asserts a more collective and compositional value, at least to older European cities, and I think also to certain American cities, such as Manhattan. In fact, when we compare it to New York, and of course we have Hong Kong on the left and a little bit of Manhattan on the right, there is in both cases a very robust urban definition, but we can begin to perceive the difference even in this comparison. The urban matrix in Hong Kong is overlain by an almost abstract insertion of tall object buildings that are simply extruded upwards from the existing sites, wherever they occur, and within an older grain of more informal and expressive uses. And I think this is a very interesting thing. I talk about it a lot in Hong Kong, talking about particular types of Asian and Hong Kong urban design. It arguably distorts established ideas of urban aesthetics, or even firm conceptualizations of urban space as we talk about it in the West. New urban configurations tend to contrast, but they also coexist with traditional place characteristics, which essentially often relate more to forms of activity than they do necessarily to physical fabric. And we also have rather strange things in Hong Kong. The traditional mainstays of Hong Kong urbanism represent forces that are to say the least, perhaps sometimes rather enigmatic by Western standards, an inherent impermanence of city value. So we have such things as buildings that were actually taken down, stored away for 30 years, the structures numbered, and then rebuilt in an entirely different situation for an entirely different function some 30 years later. We have situations where old, very nice old hotels were actually taken down, one in particular, the space left empty, and 20 years later resurrected again, virtually stone for stone. A lot of other strange things like that, which perhaps aren't so unusual really in many places, but in Hong Kong there's a particular sort of poignancy really about it. Short-life buildings are of course the result of a combination of things in Hong Kong, namely the generation of revenue to government from land transactions, the regulatory and zoning framework, that we were talking about earlier. And in combination, they act to prescribe the allowable development capacity of sites and the rather questionable approach to urban renewal, where wholesale redevelopment is generally carried out as opposed to regeneration. Well, that's a cartoon, not from Hong Kong, but it was actually a cartoon by somebody called J.F. Battaglia, who did it for a French newspaper in the 1920s. And I think you get the message. It's not too subtle, is it? And he did it really in response to the slide in the bottom left-hand corner, Le Corbusier's plan Boisson for Paris. Fortunately, it was a plan that Corbusier really felt at the time was suitable for replacing the beautiful city of Paris, which never went ahead. But the slide in the bottom right-hand corner did. That's a plan for Stuyvesant. It was built. And Hong Kong, which often lags sort of 50 years or so behind the rest of the Western world, didn't take too long in catching on to it. So the top slide actually shows exactly this sort of approach to comprehensive redevelopment that we've had to live with in Hong Kong really over the last 50 years. And this sort of very broadly shows the way in which it's done. The Urban Renewal Authority identifies older street blocks. It compensates residents and owners and moves them out, and then forms a joint venture with a developer, which might occupy perhaps 2 or 3 street blocks. So there is this idea of comprehensiveness that is being very strongly questioned in Hong Kong at the present time. Because there are really now, I think, 2 forms of city character in Hong Kong. The first is, if you like, emblemic of compartmentalization and high-rise efficiency, which is gradually producing, and I think you perhaps get the message from some of the next slides too, speed, functionalism, most certainly. But it's actually producing an undifferentiated city form of standard blocks, and we should be worried about that. When I walk around New York, as I've been doing for the last couple of days, you know, the contrast in building types and styles and ages simply takes your breath away. And it's something we've tended to lose in Hong Kong. So the spirit of place in Hong Kong is a little bit elusive. It's rarely manifested in the empirical physicality of the city, but it instead represents a constant series of insertions and adjustments that invoke different qualities of use. City building objectives, therefore, need to clearly better reflect these aspects. They're not easy to pin down precisely, and relate not just to the economic health of the city with regard to asset values of housing, commerce and tourism, but to attributes of history, memory, heritage, culture, all of which need to be reinforced rather than eroded, and which induce, of course, a range of secondary benefits associated with the preservation of vibrant communities. This particular slide comes from a series of studies that we did for the Urban Redevelopment Authority 7 years ago, really trying to show that these older areas, which are often only 6, 7, 8 stories high, but have a very strong mix of uses and great character, really can be sustained without actually having to go through this whole redevelopment process. Because it's not really a matter of bringing run-down areas back to life, but of respecting and reconstituting good city attributes. Because for many people in Hong Kong, the street is a meeting place as well as a marketplace. So we come along really to the urban design dimensions, really the sort of underlying topic of this talk. The process of urban design, I think, in the modern age, is not really about pursuing prescriptive physical solutions necessarily, but more towards integrative placemaking that needs to reflect specific dimensions and contextual values. I noticed from the work that Amanda Burton has been doing in New York that one thing that has been recognized in New York that has not been recognized in Hong Kong, and that we talk about a lot, is the value of neighborhoods of special character. And I think a lot of planning emphasis in the city through sponsored rezonings have actually tried to address this. And that's, I think, a lesson that we can learn in Hong Kong. However, in Hong Kong, the compact city, primary control over city development has become progressively diffused, so that urban design is now less part of a coherent city building and regeneration process, and more the outcome of various affiliated financial, land, and regulatory strategies. And we have to be really careful how we use these sorts of regulatory strategies, because it really does become difficult to reconcile these with other planning and community predeterminants. So we're at a very delicate point, I think, in Hong Kong now, something that perhaps later this evening Caroline might be talking about. We also have inherited from our old, if you like, our old colonial bureaucracy in Hong Kong, our infamous policy silos. For those of you who don't know that expression, they're the sort of isolated departmental policy working mechanisms where departments simply have their own agenda that they don't reconcile with those of other departments and so on. So that the planning process itself tends really to have splintered into a maze of decision-making channels that are more responsive to purely functional engineering ends that Nick talked about, compromises to efficiency, and property interest than they are to design. And we do need to focus more on sustaining urbanity. We want urbanism, not anti-urbanism. And therefore, an important role of urban design really must be to safeguard Hong Kong's unique range of qualities that do matter to the community. And we need to respect various overlapping dimensions that relate to the development process itself. We need, in many ways, to follow some of the examples of New York. Well, there are several dimensions, several broad dimensions that we can examine specifically with regard to the Hong Kong compact city context. The first of these I call the morphological dimension. The configuration of urban form in the compact city is based on several key factors, the most prominent being the street pattern, consolidated over 150 years, in many cases by successive tranches of reclamation. Also the lot pattern itself, which continues to change through subdivision or amalgamation. The built structures that are situated on all these very small lots, amalgamated lots, and the prevailing land uses. In essence, the older, fine-grained street grids, obviously influenced by topography and harbour profiles, have successively given way, particularly over the last 20 years, to a more coarser and less permeable organisation of street blocks through both redevelopment and the requirements of new super blocks and rail-related sites on the new reclamations that Thomas described so well yesterday. Thus, there's a sort of tension between the older spatial patterns that have endured up to the present time because of their essential robustness, and which produce some sort of interesting form. I like this slide because it sort of shows really the sort of imprint of the old on the new patterns of development. But this robustness, which has produced what's still one of the most enduring characteristics of the city of Hong Kong, the steep ladder streets and the market streets, and the encroaching pattern of intensification through the development of large-scale freestanding forms with their new realms of movement and social space, which can easily occupy an entire street block. So we might say that this, if you like, reflects the unstable nature of contemporary Asian urbanism, but certainly it represents the contemporary nature of Hong Kong urbanism, somewhere between the remnants of cultural heritage and the encroaching monolithic regimentation of the new. In turn, this raises questions that go beyond mere typological form to the essential difference between a single developer-managed mega-complex and the older tall tenements that I talked about before. While the latter, with its multi-ownership structure, although often in very poor physical condition, offers the inherent potential to house a changing multitude of activities in response to demand. While the modern mega-complex offers occasionally iconic single-managed landmarks, but with perhaps a rather ambiguous public identity. So if you put the two things together, sort of, one thing says hands-on, the other says quite definitely hands-off. Street environments themselves tend to reconcile intuitive values with patterns of ad hoc activity that enrich and dramatize the street frontage and often establish an interesting dialectic between internal and external space. Within this process, the tall buildings that make up the street wall often tend to lose any individually expressive identity. They, in fact, become part of a collective and, you might say, impersonal backdrop set against the elaborate foreground of the street and its commodified components. The vertical stratification of commercial and community uses with their associated activity and movement channels also underlines an essential difference between the formal framework of Western public spaces and the more diffused and informal realm where the relationship between public and private is rather less tangible, and the roots between them work just as effectively in 3 dimensions as they do in 2. And we can look at slides that I think Thomas has showed very similar slides yesterday, really. This idea of reconciling rail lines, stations, and property development, and the idea of horizontal and vertical urbanism really coming together in situations like this. And I won't say any more about that because Thomas explained it so well yesterday. Thirdly, we have the social dimension. The physical organization of urban space and its social functioning are, of course, closely intertwined. But in Hong Kong, it's not so much environmental design that influences patterns of social or behavioral activity, but the public realm that develops spontaneously around flexible street fabric, within which the local community establishes its own sets of uses, events, and realms of transaction. And they're shaped and they're animated by a whole range of uses where activities actually feed off each other. I should say, despite probably every government attempt to reduce this process. Although high-rise residential development does form the core use in Hong Kong's older urban areas, it's less bound up with an identifiable, nicely geographically prescribed local neighbourhood, and more with 3 aspects of urban scale. And one of these, of course, is the compact city itself, because it provides an easily reachable basis for employment, particularly in a situation like Hong Kong where public transport is both efficient and cheap. But also it relates to the compact district with its choice of locales and the localized street context, the casual social interweaving and identity. The 4th dimension I call the visual dimension. Again, I think we've been schooled in the West to think that visual appreciation of urban environment must be strongly geared to aesthetic considerations, closely associated with cognitive understanding and consistent architectural typologies. And I suppose, really, it also applies to new theories and new urbanism, etc. This generally relates to a well-articulated organisation of built elements, but it generally leaves out the significance of the idiosyncratic and the unpredictable, which often permeates the less formal parts of the compact city in Asia. In the context of Hong Kong's abstract urban forms and tight urban massing, built fabric can't necessarily be read in an orthodox sense, but through what I'd like to call patterns of correspondence. Streets, for example, establish a sense of expressive incident rather than architecturally contrived space. A constant interaction between complexity and order, novelty and familiarity. Also in high-rise Hong Kong, the scale of landmark buildings tends to be somewhat inverted, so that their legibility comes from a low-rise presence, which establishes a discernible quality of space. So, whereas in many cities it's the high-rise building that produces the landmarks, in Hong Kong, we've rather inverted this process. Also, activities expand to fill the spaces available. Voids in the high-density matrix become positively charged by temporary users, and somehow they establish both a visual and a functional sense of fit. And it was this, I mentioned this in passing, but it was this idea of the patterns of correspondence that gave rise to some of our proposals for the West Kowloon Cultural District. This was stage 2, by the way, Carol. Norman Foster won the competition, but if it's one thing Hong Kong has very little experience about, is building cultural complexes. But on the other hand, it has fantastic experience of building shopping centres, so why don't you combine the two? It's a contemporary approach to a new Times Square or a new West End of London. Unfortunately, having put a lot of work into this, and there was a sort of tender competition between several very large consortia in Hong Kong, government has now abandoned the entire idea, which I think is a great shame. The fifth the fifth dimension I've called the functional dimension. As much of Hong Kong's city building has been based on contingency and constantly changing physical delineation of spaces and circulation corridors, this really tends to reflect a very complex engagement between people and places. Again, Thomas described this in a more detailed way yesterday, but I think this is a sort of interesting sequence of slides, because this actually, it is in fact an airport core project linked to the development of rail infrastructure, the new airport and the in-town check-in. It relates to reclamation, infrastructure, transport and development. And again, if you put these sort of into a functional formula, they say an awful lot about our development process in Hong Kong, because the drivers aren't necessarily the drivers of city growth. The drivers are they're geared to a very important aspect of Hong Kong's functionality and efficiency. The definition of circulation and activity areas we should also talk about in passing, because arguably they have a greater impact on the setting than the architectural fabric. In the metro area, the total amount of public space is around 940 hectares, and that works out at approximately 2.8 square meters per capita. However, virtually all major spaces, unlike New York, have less to do with planning foresight than the obsolescence of large-scale uses under public ownership. So a lot of our big urban parks have come about almost accidentally. They've come about through redeveloping perhaps some of the older military establishments. I do apologize for such a very poor plan of New York, but I put these slides in really just to sort of show the difference really. In New York, quite apart from this wonderful central park, which of course was built into the planning framework of Manhattan, what's happened in recent years is that around the edge, around the waterfront, New York's been able to expand its open space. Whereas in Hong Kong, I'm showing now a slide of the Kowloon Peninsula, there's very little open space around the harbour front. But we do have these insertions of large parks, even if they're not necessarily totally well connected to surrounding areas. Being British, of course, this was the first open space in Hong Kong. It's the racetrack, which was, I think, probably built about 6 months after the handover in 1841. And we have strange things like the most unlikely park in place of Hong Kong's infamous walled city, which was detonated physically and metaphorically about 20 years ago. And a beautiful new park actually put in its position. So, you know, again, it sort of adds to this sort of idea that change brings about, wherever possible, a greater quality of open space and environment. But of course, the compact city also has a corollary in terms of a relatively building-free hinterland for recreational relief. Hong Kong has, in fact, 23 country parks and 5 marine parks. Which occupy, well, the country parks occupy approximately 43% of the entire territory. They're easily accessible by public transport, and although I'm talking off the top of my head a bit, I should think that pretty well every single person, no matter wherever they live in Hong Kong or in the new towns, in the land beyond, they're probably no more than 20 or 25 minutes from either a country park or a beach, and that's by public transport. The busiest pedestrian connections in the city are not necessarily derived just from historic streets and actual movement flows, but from a sequence of interventions in the urban fabric, involving a complicated hierarchy of movement channels and the reconciliation between public and private interests in bringing this about. Again, Thomas Ho talked about these in a longer talk yesterday, so I won't really talk about this too much. But it is interesting to really talk about the pedestrian connectors themselves. These dedicated connectors extend through lobbies, malls, atria of commercial complexes. They form part of very intricate and multi-level retail patterns. And public space therefore interfaces with a more ambiguous space that is to a large extent aimed at stimulating consumption. But they are open 24 hours a day. Commodity-oriented concourses have in fact become the new cultural constructs. They provide condensed foci for urban ritual and encounter through themed and standardized patterns of consumerism, which inevitably recasts the way in which the city is experienced. Finally, we have what I've called the temporal dimension. Temporal considerations essentially reflect the relationship between the passage of time and the urban environment. In Hong Kong, the transition of uses throughout the day means not merely changes in use, but different sets of users who inhabit urban space at different times for different purposes. Although this is by no means mutually exclusive. In the compact city, in fact, this increases the attraction of people to places, as locations are actually shared on a time basis, rather than being used intensively, but intermittently by one particular interest group. Temporal change is therefore a function of the availability of space in relation to specific interest groups that have easy access to it. Streets that might have a mundane daytime character take on new evocative associations that animate the normal experience of urban space. And this also introduces interesting aspects of time management. For example, the famous escalator sections that snake through the ladder streets to the south of the central business district and across intervening road corridors actually carry workers down from the mid-levels area to the central business district in the morning. And they're then redirected upwards in the evening, dispersing uses through adjoining streets at various levels, stimulating the growth and change of uses in neighbouring areas, and essentially promoting constantly evolving patterns of activity along its path. So as an end note, compact cities should, by their nature, be relatively sustainable, and Hong Kong is eminently so, I think, on many counts. But it does need to respect its historical trace elements in a similar way to a place that's set to embody good feng shui, which is still something to be respected in Hong Kong. In this environment of urban reinvention, complexity, and pluralism, we need to recognize the need for a balanced coexistence between flexible and more static components so that the disparate parts of the city can be mutually reinforcing. And I'd like to end up by a definition of urban placemaking that I think fits this context, whether in Hong Kong or New York. And I think of none better than that given by an old tutor of mine at college, Colin Rowe, who wrote this in a book on Collage City. He describes it as being a value system for the city, simultaneously an appeal for order and disorder, for the simple and the complex, for the joint existence of permanent reference and random happening, of the private and the public, of innovation and tradition, of both the retrospective and the prophetic gesture. I think this suits Hong Kong very well. Thank you.